Okay, friends, this is the third video lecture on the topic of middle childhood. I left off with this slide with a brief introduction of some of the social and emotional disorders that may begin showing up in early childhood. This is not necessarily a common thing to happen, but if you are in tune to some of the patterns of behavior, we might begin to recognize these patterns of behavior in children as early as 6 to 12. The last slide under the title or in the chapter of physical development is actually about developmental disorders. What gets the category of a developmental disorder I don't even really like the term disorder. I would prefer to call them differences, but because our textbook uses that language, I will stick with that language. But what gets the label of a developmental disorder is if they show up early in life. And if we can see these diagnoses and these behaviors in small children. So under this umbrella, or under this category, the three that we're going to talk briefly about is autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, attention deficit, and pervasive developmental delay. So these labels come from the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, the big book. We're currently on the 5th edition, and the significance of the book is that it's a shared language of behaviors that professionals can use. The fact that it's number 5 means that these labels and these patterns change. In the 4th edition of the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, or the DSM, autism was actually broken down into different categories. You had Asperger's disorder and you had autism, and I think under there you actually have pervasive developmental delay. The new one puts all of these patterns of behaviors together, and we call them a spectrum disorder. So it gets called a spectrum when there are continuums of these behaviors. If you're familiar with autism, you probably know some of the most common characteristics are sort of a fixed interest, impaired social skills, which typically we see in communication. Often there's like a lack of eye contact. There may be a fixation on a particular topic. There may be differences in inflection, in the rhythm of one's speech and the volume of one's speech. There may be differences in, so my boy is on the spectrum. I'm trying to think about the patterns, the observations I see in his and his friends. So there would be differences in like the rhythm of their speech, the volume, the topic of speech, the give and take in a conversation, in a co-conversation, and the looking at somebody in the eyes, these kinds of things. So repetitive restrictive behavior. Sometimes it'll look like maybe they only have one interest. There's a whole discussion in your textbook, but again, we call them developmental because they show up early in life. Then we also talk about attention deficit and hyperactivity, which is actually two different disorders. You can be, the book discusses how you can have combined presentation, which you have both the hyperactive and the attention deficit, or somebody may present predominantly with just the inattention, or you might have predominantly the hyperactive impulsive. But there are two different patterns of behavior. The one is the inattention, the ability to follow through, the ability to stay on task. Often it looks like you lose things. Adults can get diagnosed with these conditions. My daughter got a diagnosis at 22. A friend of mine got a diagnosis at like 60 of these sort of patterns of behavior. They sometimes look a little different between men and women. Your book does offer an explanation, or does point out that these are not caused by the things that our culture may have told us. They're not caused by too much sugar. They're not caused by too much television. These are brain conditions that are identifiable early in life. The hyperactivity is the one that may look a little bit like fidgeting, can't sit still, talks really fast, maybe walks really fast. So when you put them together, you got somebody who may have some trouble getting things done and always seems to be kind of on edge. But they don't always go together. And then the last one on this slide is pervasive developmental delay. I read a book many years ago that argued that pervasive developmental delay is a generic term that doctors may give families who may not be prepared to have have one of those other labels. But for our textbook purposes, we're going to define it as delayed communication skills and difficulty mastering the socialization development of childhood. All right, so let's shift gears a little bit, and now we're going to go to the cognitive chapter, remembering that cognitive is about thinking, and cognitive development is the fancy term for how children's brains change in their ability to think. There are two slides in here that discuss different kinds of intelligences, different kinds of ways that we think. One of them, we're going to talk about Pinochet. We've talked about him before, his concrete operational stages of development. So some of these things may be familiar, but what a child should be able to do when we get to middle childhood, so when they get to like 6 to 12, a child should understand or comprehend some of these things, right? So like serialization, they should be able to put objects in some sort of qualitative order. Maybe it's size, maybe it's color, whatever. Classification, so they should be able to organize things based on some sort of abstract or arbitrary classification. Reversibility. So reversibility is the example that they should understand that ice can become water and it can become ice again, but it's still that's still the same thing. Conservation is the classic beaker, right? So this is the illustration of it's the same amount of water if it's in a tall, skinny cup or if it's in a short cup. A child of this age should understand it's the same amount of water, which in concrete that word. Decentralizate, that word, that next word, is an element similar to conservation, and that simply means that when we use the example of the tall beaker to the short glass, that the child doesn't get fixated on the shape of the glass, but they're able to sort of understand, they're able to comprehend, and I'm not explaining that very well. It won't be a quiz question. And then was it talk about identity, and identity is an abstract that I believe the example is that a child is able to understand that an egg is an egg if it's broken, if it's scrambled, if it's whole, if it's hard boiled. They still can comprehend that that is still an egg. And I think maybe it uses an example of, that's the next one, is the idea of a dog, that they can take the concept of a dog is a mammal and a bulldog is a dog, so therefore the bulldog is a mammal. Maybe I'll put a little quiz or I'll put a little video in there that helps you explain it. But the point is that children have developed a more sophisticated understanding of the concrete, objective world, right? And we're talking about the concrete world. All right. So another way of thinking about cognitive development or kinds of intelligences is Steinberg's theory here, and that's I believe it's, oh man, I used to know how to say that word. I'd have to go Google it. But the notion is that there are three different ways of thinking, three different kinds of intellectual skills or intellectual ways of thinking. You have the analytical intelligence, and some people can be good at all three of these, or some people can be good at one or the other. But we start to see these developments in early childhood. So you've got the analytical intelligence, and this is a kind of intelligence that's based on computation, academic comprehension, logical. Typically, this is the one that people get rewarded for, right? The creative is the experiential, the one, a kind of intellect that can incorporate new ideas into new situations, that they're quick to pick up new skills. And then you have the practical. This word should be, this should be in quotations because I have a philosophical issue with this term of common sense. But the practical knowledge is a kind of knowledge that is based on context. So this means that you can use the situation, you can use what you know, and you can apply what you know to the particular concept. Sometimes we call that common sense, but I philosophically don't think there really is such thing as common sense. So that's Steinsberg's. Before I move on to the next one, because there's 9 of them, and I don't want to rush them into a quick, just a few seconds, I'm going to stop here and I'm going to pick up the 4th video lecture talking about Gardner's multiple intelligence.